Straight from the streets of New York City, Porkins Policy Radio. Here's Pierce Redmond.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Porkins Policy Radio. As always, I am your host, Pierce Redmond. You can find this show here at my website, which is porkinspolicyreview.com. You can also, of course, find me archived at ocelli.com and live every Tuesday from 3 to 5 here at ocelli.com. You can find the links to the live stream broadcast over at ocelli.com. You can also hop in the chat room if you want to send us some questions. And I think in the second hour, we will open up the phone line. So I will try and get the number in front of me, and I'll let everybody know about that in a little bit. And of course, we'll preface the second hour with that. But we are joined by a frequent guest, a good friend of the show. In fact, the person responsible for this excellent new theme music that he composed exclusively for me. That is, of course, our good friend Robbie Martin of Media Roots Radio, MediaRoots.org, also a very heavy agenda.com. Robbie, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you, Pierce?
Excellent.
It's awesome to hear the song.
I know, right? Yeah, I know. It's good to have the composer on the show. And I'm glad that you liked the little edits and things that we did and the voiceovers and stuff, and it's a really good song. I've had nothing but praise. I was actually I was like blasting it last weekend at a friend's birthday. We were driving back from bowling, and I was blasting it in the car ride, and everybody loved it. Also, Robbie, maybe at some point, I mentioned this last week on the show. Maybe we'll, for the the Patreon subscribers or something, we'll put together, we'll offer like the full song or something like that, for download. Because there's a lot more. Obviously, that's just sort of the nature of a radio show. There's only so much we can include, but there's so many other great little portions in the song. So I hope people check it out, and also maybe try their best to decipher some of the lyrics, because the lyrics that Robbie did on the song are very, very I would say kind of tongue in cheek. Hats off if anyone. Maybe we could do like a little I don't know, like giveaway or a sweepstakes or something. If you can correctly decipher what's in some of the lyrics, maybe you'll get a special prize.
That would be great, yeah.
From Robbie and I.
I would be really curious.
Yeah.
If anyone guesses it, yeah, I would be impressed.
Yes.
I mean, the funny part is I can decipher it completely, and when I made it, I was like, I was worried that everybody else would be able to also. So it's pretty awesome that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, there's pieces where I think I can hear something, but it's sort of like the old song "Cyber People" by Polaris. It's like you listen to it long enough and you think you know what they're saying, but you don't really know. I'm not sure exactly what they're saying. I don't even know if Polaris is speaking in English or Italian or German or what. So it's always interesting. But yeah, anyone that can decipher them, definitely email. You can email me at porkinspolicy@gmail.com, and we'll figure out a special prize for people that get the lyrics correct. But Robbie, I've got you. I've actually got Robbie for both hours, so this will be. I think this will be a good episode. We've got a lot to cover. Unfortunately, my guest Christian Cipollini had to reschedule, so we'll probably have him on next week to discuss the murder of Frank Cali. But now we've got Robbie Martin for both hours of the show. As I said, in the second hour, I think we'll open up the phone lines. So if you want to, if you're listening live right now and you're interested in calling in, you can always go to ocelli.com, find the phone number there. I'll list it as well in a little bit. But here in the first hour, I wanted to talk with Robbie about a recent episode, a solo show he did on Media Roots Radio entitled Ecstasy, Israeli Art Students, and the Mossad. It's over 2 hours. Highly recommend people listen to it. It's an excellent show. It's filled with tons of information. There's some great audio clips that you throw in there, and once again, your skill at with music really shines through in this episode. I loved that that sort of like rave song that you played at the beginning, and with the various news clips thrown in there, the echo when they say like DEA is so good. It's really really it's a great episode. I like the episodes that you've been doing lately. You and Abby have done a couple of them that are more kind of like, I don't know, almost like audio documentaries. They're really good. The one on the anthrax attacks, for instance. But this one is no exception. And to my knowledge, it's one of the most, if not the most, sort of comprehensive, nuanced looks at the issue of Israeli art students, ecstasy trafficking, the involvement of Mossad in this. You also talk about the dancing Israelis, or the so-called dancing Israelis. I think we'll discuss that a little bit later. But like I said, this is really like a comprehensive look at this topic, which I think it gets kind of, it gets touched on here and there in various, alternative media outlets, conspiracy theory videos, and things of that nature. But it's always sort of like especially the Israeli art students, it's always this kind of this little like tangential thing, like, oh, and this happened also, but it's like a footnote to a lot of people.
Yeah.
And what struck me is how, big this story is. And in my opinion, and maybe we'll discuss this as well, I think the issue of the Israeli art students is actually more important than the dancing Israelis. I think there's more to the Israeli art student angle. I think it, in a lot of ways, it links directly into 9/11, in some cases even in a more in-your-face way than the dancing Israeli angle. And there's so much more to explore with this particular incident through government documents, through news reports, across the board, multiple states. Robbie, what made you want to cover this story in the first place? And then explain, just define what are this phenomenon known as the Israeli art students?
Well, it's kind of a little bit of a complicated history of how I got to wanting to cover this story. I come from a background of, being very familiar with 9/11 truth, way back before I got more into, covering just issues of broader foreign policy before I'd start doing the podcast. So I'd always heard of the dancing Israeli story. And I remember, back when I would talk about 9/11, there would always be someone who would be like, you're covering up for Israel or whatever, because you're not talking about the dancing Israeli story. And there was an awful lot of people on the internet who only wanted to talk about that aspect of 9/11. And a lot of those people, no surprise, were sort of crossing over with the white nationalist sort of militia movements that had a large dose of anti-Semitism involved in their movements. So just as a researcher, as someone who, never really had shared those views, I kind of stayed away from the issue, and I more or less saw it as an exaggeration or a hyperbolic narrative that had taken hold and was sort of seized on by more anti-Semitic, white nationalist kinds of truthers, basically. The overwhelming majority of truthers are not, don't revolve around the narrative that somehow Israel was behind the attacks. But these people, that is sort of their narrative. So, and after years and years of sort of being bludgeoned by, different people trying to share the story with me, I started to take maybe a closer look at just that individual story to figure out what happened. It wasn't really that particularly interesting to me at the time. Even still, that story to me, like you said, is honestly much smaller than the larger story of the Israeli art student spy ring. So it actually wasn't until I randomly stumbled across a comment, and this is like maybe 3 years after initially looking at some of this, stuff about the dancing Israelis who were filming the World Trade Centers collapsing. I stumbled across a comment by a guy named Emanuel Sferios, who was posting on John Gold's wall, as you know, John Gold as well. And he just went off on this like rant. It was like 8 paragraphs long, about how he remembers encountering this group of what we now know were Israeli spies posing as Israeli art students going door to door trying to sell their art. And what was so fascinating to me about this particular individual, Emanuel, being confronted by or being approached by the Israeli art students, is Emanuel's main thing, and he spent his entire life trying to create a public safety campaign for ways for people to safely use MDMA and psychedelic drugs, but specifically MDMA. And his organization, Dance Safe, their role was going to raves in the 1990s, and they still do this, where they set up a booth and allow people to come and get their ecstasy pills tested for adulterants. So essentially, if you're at a rave and you buy pills from a drug dealer, before taking them, you could bring them to this booth. And oftentimes Emanuel was actually there personally, helping people test their pills. And, if it had speed in it or something else that wasn't supposed to be in it, it's sort of like, oh, but, bad luck, you bought a bad pill, you probably shouldn't take this, kind of a thing. Mm-hmm. And it actually probably saved, countless amounts of lives, because the only hospitalizations and deaths that we really know about from people ingesting E were from actually not even from MDMA. It was from adulterants in the E pills, the pressed pills that were being manufactured at the time. The DEA at the time was also trying to make it seem like all these deaths and hospitalizations were from MDMA, and they weren't. They were from adulterants. And Emanuel has also been quite involved in spreading, fighting propaganda that the DEA was putting out at the time, which was essentially trying to make it seem like MDMA was a killer, it was killing all these people, and it needed to be stopped. So Emanuel was very involved in pushing back on, drug war propaganda put out by the DEA. He was very involved in the rave scene. These booths that Dance Safe would set up would pretty much be at every conceivable rave that was happening. I mean, I remember seeing them pretty much every time I went to a rave in the 90s. And they had chapters set up in every major city across the United States. So Emanuel's story about meeting these Israeli art students was so fascinating, because he thought that they were like American undercover agents coming to spy on his operation. Right. Because at the time, Dance Safe, operating in 1999, was doing something that the DEA and other U.S. government agencies would have been upset about, which was basically trying to combat the propaganda they're putting out. I mean, and it was kind of operating in a legal gray area too, because Dance Safe would handle, people's illegal drugs and test them for them. So that's already kind of a risky endeavor. It's a very ballsy thing for him to be a part of. So make a long story short, this visit that he got in 1999 was so strange to him that he remembered it. He didn't know anything about these art students being part of a spy ring or anything. At the time, he just thought they were possibly DEA agents who were spying on him and trying to figure out what he was doing. It wasn't until many years later that Emanuel read about that there was a giant Israeli spy ring operating in the United States, all posing as these art students. So once he found that out, he sort of, he had this realization, oh, wow, they weren't DEA. They were actually Israeli spies spying mostly on DEA facilities, which is actually what the story, that's what ended up being reported on and documented, which was that this 200-person large Israeli spy ring operating in the United States was actually primarily spying on DEA facilities in the United States, and not just the facilities and the offices of the DEA, but the employees of the DEA's personal homes and their neighborhoods as well. The Israeli art students would figure out where the DEA agents and even like desk employees, like people who like just push papers at the DEA, right, were getting visits from these Israeli art students. Everything from lead investigators to random low-level employees were being visited by these students. And it wasn't just the DEA. It was also the EPA, the FBI, the NSA, I think even in one instance, the CIA building was visited. But it was, if you look at the documentation, and most of this actually comes from a leaked memo officially put out by the DEA, it seems to be somewhere around 90% of the activity of this Israeli spy ring group was fixated on the DEA specifically. And that just kind of blew my mind in a way that where I imagined, this Israeli spy ring, I'd always understood it as some kind of, group that was tracking Al-Qaeda or somehow had foreknowledge about what these Al-Qaeda suspects in the United States were doing. I had no idea up until I read that comment that the majority of what the spy ring was doing had to do with U.S.
Right.
drug enforcement, which is just so incredibly bizarre, just on its face, until you sort of learn about how much of the ecstasy trade actually revolves around not just Israel as a country, but like Israelis in general. How many Israelis were instrumental in this global ecstasy trafficking trade? And there's so much more to that. I mean, we can go more into that in detail, but I mean, that was sort of the basis for the investigation into this story that I did for the podcast. And it does also connect to 9/11, which is even weirder, that somehow this has to do with drugs, ecstasy, and the 9/11 attacks, and these apparent hijackers that were behind them. It all sort of links together in this very odd way. And by the end of the podcast, my conclusion was, it honestly doesn't make sense. Like, It doesn't, even if you connect ecstasy to this, which it seems like it does connect to it, it still doesn't explain it. Still doesn't really make, there's really no logical reason for the spy ring to exist. Even if they were trying to spy on, the ecstasy trade here in the United States and the enforcement against it, it's still really odd what they were doing. So there's a lot of questions that it brings up. And, unfortunately, most of them are just unanswered kind of mysteries. And that's sort of how I left the podcast with that. We really don't know what this was.
Yeah, and that particular idea of not knowing how this relates to 9/11. That's something you and I have discussed multiple times. When we've done episodes on 9/11 and various aspects of it. I mean, the more you, unlike a lot of other deep events, large scale cover-ups, however you want to define it, there is something about 9/11 where there are so many layers to it, and when you start to look into one particular aspect of it, you can kind of begin to piece together, okay, this is how these pieces fit together. Like, I think, which is why I encourage people to look at it like the Alex Station thing. There's quite a bit there where you can really kind of just explore Alex Station, and you can kind of begin to see how this really came into being, why information was deliberately not being passed along, how stuff happened. But then you add just, one other little aspect of it, and suddenly it becomes this very jumbled mess. And you don't quite get how this all kind of fits in together. And the Israeli art student one is such an interesting one. I mean, you were starting to you touched on it there just a minute ago, and the Israeli art student stuff connects in a direct way to 9/11. I think even, like I said, even more so than the dancing Israelis filming stuff in Jersey, by the mere fact that this operation, and I want to explore the operation in a little bit more detail in a second, but this operation spanned the entire United States. I mean, it wasn't like specific to any one region or other. I mean, there are places up in New York. Yeah, the South was sort of the main one. And in particular, a lot of the largest concentration of these Israeli art students, in air quotes, that were going around basically soliciting art to various DEA employees, which is we'll get into what they were actually trying to sell. But the largest concentration of this, and I believe this is according to the DEA's own internal memos and stuff on this, was in Hollywood, Florida, where 14 of the 19 hijackers lived. And isn't there even some evidence to suggest that there were Israeli art students living next door to Mohammed Atta?
Well, that's the craziest part. This is well documented. Is that they were actually, some of these Israeli art students lived next door, and that is definitely on the record. That there's no dispute about that, and also there's no dispute about the other thing you just said about them being mostly concentrated in Hollywood, Florida. That's in the official DEA memo. So that's a coincidence. I mean, that's not a coincidence you can write off. That is very strange. But what they've done since then, is they've tried to, and there's been people, when I say they, I just mean the overall consensus on that seems to have softened to the point where you have these two extremes where, on the internet, we go look this information up, and half of the debate, mostly conspiracy people, it gravitates towards, well, that means that these people were directly involved in 9/11, and it was some kind of them setting up these patsy hijackers, Saudi hijackers as part of some kind of Mossad operation. I mean, that's like mostly what you see on that side of the debate. And the other side of the debate, like Christopher Ketchum and other journalists, like non-conspiracy people who really tried to pick apart all the layers to this, they've concluded that it was likely some kind of intelligence gathering operation on Al-Qaeda activity, and that the Mossad had some secret backdoor deal with the CIA, like they often do throughout history, to essentially allow them to operate on U.S. soil and spy on Al-Qaeda suspects for their own interests as a mutual sort of agreed upon thing. And actually, I'm probably putting words in Ketchum's mouth there. I don't think he concluded all of that, but I think that's sort of that's sort of how the story kind of just settled at a certain point among sort of the journalistic consensus. But even those people will acknowledge that it still doesn't make sense, and it was definitely very much covered up, and it was buried. I mean, they will acknowledge that the story inexplicably disappeared. People stopped talking about it. Their sources all dried up around the same time. So there was no argument that this was a deliberate cover-up and a huge embarrassment, especially for the government agencies that were essentially trying to bring light to this, like people in the DEA. Now, it's funny. Additionally, the Justice Department actually released a statement after that DEA memo leaked, saying that it was from a disgruntled DEA agent who was he was paranoid. Huh. So that's as far as I know, that was the Bush administration sort of putting the final kibosh on that story. That was how they tried to deal with it. But there's video clips of Colin Powell and Ari Fleischer both acknowledging that hundreds of Israeli spies were rounded up before and after 9/11. Like the press knew enough about the story at that time to ask, the Bush administration during press conferences. Yeah. So there's evidence that there was a very large awareness among even the DC journalistic class about the story for a short period of time, and then it just disappeared. So that's pretty clear. You can see that happened, and to me, none of those narratives that I just mentioned make any sense really. They all sound overly simplified and sort of designed to tie everything up in a neat little bow, when in reality it really does just, to me, widen the mystery and the weirdness of not just 9/11 but that whole time period. I mean, leading up to it.
Yeah, because again, if I don't at all, full disclosure, subscribe to the idea that this is, evidence. This is the smoking gun of, the Zionist plot to commit 9/11, and that all of these Al-Qaeda operatives are really just Mossad patsies. First off, there's just not enough evidence beyond Israeli art students, the Israeli spies, and that somehow means that this grand global conspiracy was being hatched. I mean, there's just not enough evidence for me, at least. I'm sure some people will disagree with us. And very, very quickly, the call-in number for the second hour is 319-527-5016. If people want to call in and perhaps ask questions about this or some of the other stuff we'll be discussing in the second hour as well. But, and then on the flip side of that, I do think that the Christopher Ketchum, Alexander Coburn angle, because they've both written about this, in Counterpunch, and I think Ketchum also wrote it for Slate as well about the Israeli art students. Salon, excuse me.
Might be
Salon.
Slate, yeah.
One of those about the Israeli art students, also the dancing Israelis. Also, the Jewish Forward did good reporting on the dancing Israelis and the Israeli art student spy ring.
Yeah.
So it's out there.
And just for the record, Christopher Ketchum, even as far back as I think 2002 or 2003, said that Salon and Harper's both rejected is like one of his last really in-depth reports about it. That shows how third rail this subject even was back then. It's strange because in a way it's almost become more third rail since, because most of the associations with it have to do with, the conspiracy theory, the truther angle. So it's like, it's even more complicated now to talk about it.
Oh, yeah, exactly. No. You're totally right, Robbie. You really can't bring it up. The second you bring it up, it's this, you're this, racist, anti-Semitic, right-wing conspiracy theory about 9/11 and the Zionists and Israel. Yeah, exactly. It's wonderfully designed almost in a way where you can't bring it up. But yeah, there were people. Let's also, I'm sure we'll talk about him a little bit later. But Carl Cameron, maybe the last semi-decent journalist at Fox News, did a series of reports on the Israeli art students. Some of the deeper stuff. Talking about Amdocs, which I want to get your take on in a little bit. And and he was basically told to stop covering it. And he was, he was even, asked on like C-SPAN when he, Washington Journal, like multiple calls, people calling and saying, what's the deal with this, Carl? Why, and he's, you get the impression from him. Somebody told him, you got to drop this story. You're not reporting on this. You're not going any deeper. And Carl Cameron at the time seemed to have really well-placed sources that were giving him stuff that nobody else had. Stuff that was then, later backed up in these internal documents and memos. So, but just to quickly, just to go back, I think that the Christopher Ketchum, Alexander Coburn angle, that this was some kind, and again, I think you're correct there, Robbie. I don't know if that's what Ketchum, unequivocally states, but that's certainly the theory that he floated as a distinct possibility, that this was some kind of surveillance operation. I don't think that really fully makes sense. Again, like, you really think the CIA is above spying on... First off, they do spy on American citizens within the borders of America. So, I don't know why they would have a problem spying on terrorists within America. And furthermore, even if they weren't okay with that and they contracted this out to Mossad, what is the deal with the whole art student angle and going around to DEA, NSA facilities and trying to sell crappy artwork? That just doesn't make any sense. What is that, just like a side project that seemingly not just the CIA, but everyone, DEA, FBI, NSA, EPA, all of these groups just kind of let them do? And maybe because I don't know if we've defined it yet, Robbie. Explain just like the scenario. You're let's say, Robbie Martin, DEA agent, is at home, minding his own business. He hears a knock on the door, and he opens it to find like two young Israeli art students. What happens? What's the scenario?
Well, it could range. So sometimes you get approached by a beautiful young college-aged Israeli woman who would, sometimes be flirtatious with you. And sometimes it would be a pair of males, college-age males. And they would, oftentimes, one of the characteristics that the DEA discusses is, so like I answer the door, start talking to these guys. One of them is carrying a portfolio, like a legit, artist portfolio filled with actual pieces of original art, or that appear to be original art, pastels, oil paintings, watercolors, different styles of art. And they would tell me that, they're interested in selling me, one of these pieces of art, but their main plan is they want to get, they're basically trying to spread the word about a gallery opening that they're doing. So these Israeli art students would try to butter me up and, tell me that they're getting involved in my community, somehow putting on an art show, and that this was in some way some kind of promotion for that show. I might buy a painting from them just to get them the hell off my property, because I live in a rural area, and it's unusual for door-to-door salesmen to come, to my door, or actually it's unheard of. So the experience is already off-putting enough where I might just want to be like, okay, I'll buy one of your $75 paintings because this is the experience just creeping me out. I want you off my property. But, if I was just the kind of person where I was like, no solicitors here, please get off my property, they might refuse to leave and actually make such a ruckus and be so strange acting that I'll have to call the cops to get them to leave my property, which is actually something that happened dozens of times with these Israeli art students. And if I was a different kind of person, if I was kind of a more acquiescent, person who got intimidated easily, I might even, agree to let one of these Israeli art students inside my home to use my telephone or to use my bathroom, which happened pretty frequently as well. That was a characteristic of their visits, is they would ask to enter the private residence of DEA agents' homes. It's not clear in the memo how many times that actually happened, that they got in, but they were caught trespassing several times on U.S. government property. Like they would go to the front desk of a government building, and then they would be like told to leave because they don't take, solicitors. And then they'd be spotted later, like trespassing on like a runway of like a military base, and arrested. So just in terms of the idea that this was a legit, like serious intelligence gathering operation, and it was trying to be done under the radar, doesn't line up with what they actually did and how they behaved.
Yeah.
So that's another aspect of the story that needs to be examined, is why were they acting so nuts and getting arrested so often, doing this? It wasn't like, from my understanding, this is something I tried to pick apart when doing the research for this, it's hard to find each individual story and how they were rounded up, because we know that by, I think, 2 months after 9/11, up to, or maybe even over 200 of these suspected Israeli spies, most of them self-identified art students, were rounded up and arrested. What's interesting is it seems like, from my reading, and I'm not sure if this is the case, so someone can correct me on this, it appears that most of them got themselves arrested from just acting bizarrely and doing just illegal things, selling without a permit, driving with an expired license, not leaving someone's property, trespassing, doing strange things like approaching two undercover police who are on a stakeout trying to sell art to them. Right. The police found it so suspicious they questioned the person. I mean, so that kind of behavior sort of fits the profile of the Israeli art students, which isn't the behavior of a legit intelligence gathering group of people in an intelligence gathering operation. That doesn't seem to line up with that. But what's weird, Pierce, is it does line up in a strange way with the behavior of some of the Al-Qaeda hijackers.
Yeah.
Specifically Mohammed Atta trespassing on an airbase and trying to climb into the cockpit of a crop duster plane and getting kicked out.
Right, or what was it?
Or driving, or he got arrested. He got arrested for an expired license, I believe, as well, Mohammed Atta. So it's odd.
I was going to say too, when he got into like an argument in like the DMV or something like that, and the
USDA.
Yeah, and he made alluded to terrorist attacks and stuff like that. He also seemed to tell people that he was going to do something, and also, of course, I mean, just in a more tangential level, I mean things like snorting coke with strippers and whatnot.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's the strangest thing ever. And one of the things that popped out to me, Pierce, that kind of at the end of all this, which just really struck me as being very odd, is if you look at the DEA memo and the behavior that they describe of all these Israeli art students doing, specifically casing U.S. government buildings by taking photographs and trespassing on them, that's kind of lines up very similarly to what the Bush administration would put out as ways to identify, like if you see something, say something after 9/11 about, like, if you see a Middle Eastern, group of guys taking pictures at a military base, call the FBI. It's odd that behavior of this Israeli art student spying lines up with what the Bush administration tried to warn the public about later about how Al-Qaeda operatives might act. So that's also just kind of a strange thing to me.
Well, there's also sort of the again, my issue with the dancing Israelis is that it's such sloppy spycraft. Why would they be out in the open filming this? Why would they be high-fiving and, as some of the reports state, holding up lighters like they were at a rock concert? I mean, that's just, if you're really there. And then, I mean, you can even...
And they were. I mean, that's just for the record, that they were doing that. I mean, like, that they really were doing that. And the only thing I think from that story that is up for dispute that truthers have really latched onto is that they were filming it before the plane hit. That hasn't been proven. But the other stuff you're saying is all documented, and there's eyewitnesses to testify to that.
And then again, too, why would this, supposedly clandestine surveillance operation then go on a national talk show in Israel and admit, we were there to film 9/11? I mean, like, again, and that's only used by, a certain type of truther to point, you see, look, they're admitting it. They must be behind it. And it's just sort of like, come on. I mean, Mossad is way more sophisticated than that. If you think that's how they operate, I mean, they've conned you hook, line, and sinker. They've completely got you. I mean, if you really think that's how they operate, I mean, no, this is an extremely powerful, sophisticated intelligence apparatus. They're not going to just, if they're broadcasting it out like that, it again, to me, seems like a deliberate distraction. That's always how I've categorized the dancing Israeli issue, although I'm not like dismissing it totally out of hand. But again, that aside, the Israeli art student spying is just so much more, I don't know, confusing and complex, because, I mean, and I mean, I don't think there really is an answer, or you don't have an answer for this, Robbie. I certainly don't. I mean, it's just like, what was the point of that? Why were they, what information could they possibly gather by going to people's houses and trying to sell them art? I mean, like you said, I mean, there's only a couple scenarios. They either get arrested, which just looks bad, I mean, it doesn't make, it doesn't bode well for them. They're going to be on at least the local police's radar. But I mean, in some of these other cases, I mean, NSA facilities, sneaking onto military bases. I mean, you got military intelligence looking at you. But even beyond that, if they sell some art, or they get inside the house to use the bathroom, I mean, there's not that much information that you could gather. I mean, again, if they were really spying on all of these different government agencies, I mean, there's got to be better ways. Either inserting someone directly in there, I mean, you mentioned sometimes it would be a beautiful woman selling art. I mean, seduction, obviously. I mean, honeypots are a well-known spy tactic. I mean, that makes more sense, but we don't seem to see that, or we don't have reports of that happening. So again, I'm so, I don't know, perplexed at what they were really trying to do. Or is this possibly more of a distraction for something, look over here at the Israeli art students, not at something else?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I think that it being some kind of distraction or a smokescreen is probably the most likely scenario because of how much noise and attention it generated and how non-secretive it was. But a distraction from what? If the argument is this was designed to draw away resources from counterterrorism investigations by the United States because the Mossad wanted to, have the upper hand in tracking these Al-Qaeda suspects, that doesn't make sense, because why would they be focusing so much on the DEA? It's not like making so much noise at the DEA is going to draw away resources from the FBI's counterterrorism efforts. So, I mean, technically the FBI before 9/11 was the agency that was doing, most of the counterterrorism stuff. And, they would be the ones who would be operating in the United States. And there's very little, I don't even think the FBI comes up really in this DEA memo. The DEA themselves speculate that there is crossover with some of the Israeli art students and suspects in ongoing drug investigations, ecstasy investigations. That's all they really speculate about what this intelligence gathering operation could be connected to, or like what it's for. They also say in the memo, they instruct agents and employees of the DEA not to discuss any ongoing investigations. So the DEA seems to believe, at least at the time they wrote this memo, that this Israeli spy ring had something to do with their drug investigations, and their operations trying to like squash drug rings. That's odd too, because like you said, if this Israeli spy ring's real purpose was to like thwart the DEA trying to stop the ecstasy trade for some reason, then why would they go about it this way? Why would what were they like? Even if a top DEA investigator led an Israeli art student into his home, how long are they going to be in there and be able to like get something out of his like files that would actually be like useful? I mean, it seems very unlikely. I mean, computer hacking, would make more sense, or, like planting a mole inside one of those organizations would make more sense.
Or somehow trying to get an agent in a compromising position, like an affair, or I don't know, bribery or something. I mean, there's so many more tried and true spy tactics that, again, agencies like Mossad, CIA, MI6, all spy agencies employ. This one seems like, again, it seems bizarre. And to also make it, it spans the entire country. I mean, it seems predominantly focused down, in the southern half of the United States. But I mean, this was obviously, Emanuel Sferios, that was in what was that, Oakland? That he was approached?
Yeah, it was in Oakland. And I just should mention again that he didn't work at the DA. He worked at like a public, like a private organization that would help people make sure they were taking like unadulterated ecstasy. So
that's even weirder that he was approached. Because what information are they trying to get?
Exactly. And he immediately, he found the interaction so suspicious that he thought they were U.S. government agents. And he didn't have, his office wasn't designed to get visitors. It was a private office suite that never got random visitors. It was by appointment only. So for someone to just come knocking on the door was just really bizarre in and of itself. Very suspicious behavior. I mean, if your goal is to sort of, do this on the sly and to not draw suspicion, it's one of the craziest things they could do. It would make more sense for one of them to approach Emanuel at a rave and pretend they're like a raver or something.
Right, exactly.
And talk to him.
And they might actually glean some information, because exactly. In the interview, Emanuel says, he wasn't giving them details about dance safe or any. Not that he would even. I don't even know what details he could give them that would even be important to him.
That's what's so inexplicable about it. Yeah, and coming from his background, he's very careful about what he's going to say to people, because if you're involved in that scene, there's that undercover cops are often the ones that will bust or take people down. So it's his immediate reaction was suspicion. As soon as he opened, as soon as he heard a knock on the door, right, he was just like, "What the hell's going on?" So that's the part that I keep going back to about what, if this was a distraction or a smokescreen, what was it a smokescreen from? Because, if it had anything to do with 9/11 or this tracking of Al-Qaeda suspect, why would the DEA, why would that's the part that just doesn't add up. And that's what makes me think there's just there's so much more to discover here that we simply don't have access to. You mentioned the Carl Cameron report. he was extremely lucky in the sense that he got, dozens of internal government documents that basically created the roadmap for his story. We only have access to, at this point, 2 documents. One of them is like 3 paragraphs long, from a I don't know the organization. It's some kind of it's like the DNI, but it's not the DNI. They put out a warning about Israeli art students before the DEA did, and that DEA memo was not meant for public consumption. That leaked, but we have all these other dozens of maybe up to a dozen documents that Carl Cameron talks about that we've never seen that point to even crazier things, and they implicate things much wilder than what the DEA memo does.
Well, and one of the things that Carl Cameron talked about in that I think it was a 4-part series he did on Fox before it was quietly shut down is the issue of Amdocs. And let's just touch on that briefly, Robbie, because that's again, it's like so many of the when you begin looking into and investigating and researching 9/11 and related topics. I mean, it's like a whole other story, which again, I don't quite understand how Amdocs fits into this, beyond it just being like yet another strange coincidence. I mean, if we can even call it that. I mean, what is Amdocs and how does that relate to the Israeli art students?
Well, this is a totally other rabbit hole of it. That's really fascinating to me. This company, Amdocs, was a huge company in the mid-'90s, and they were responsible for a large percentage of even U.S. phone companies' telephone records. They would essentially be in charge of the database of phone records for all these phone companies. So essentially, they had access to this really valuable data that could be useful to certain groups of people. So what happened was in 1997, this is not detailed in the memo, the DEA memo itself, but it came out through various leaks. Carl Cameron, actually, I think was the one to first report this. Then in 1997, the government described in internal documents having a major drug trafficking operation, an ecstasy trafficking operation blown that was a joint effort between the Secret Service, the DEA, the FBI, and the LAPD. And this was such a egregious and strange thwarting of their sting operation that they immediately suspect and put in print in a document that they suspect that the actual operation was blown by a back door in the 2 different companies that they had relationships with. One of them had a broader role. It was Amdocs, and their role, this company, and it happened to be a privately owned Israeli company that was operating in the United States that the U.S. government worked with, was to keep all the phone records. This other company called Converse Infosys was responsible for some kind of digital management of the phone system. I don't really understand exactly what they did, but according to the government, the important role that they played was they were able to set up wiretaps, like digital wiretaps, through their system for the federal government. So the DEA and the FBI would work with Converse Infosys and be able to tap people's phone numbers when they would get warrants. And Converse and the DEA were the only sort of parties in that equation that were supposed to know about the particular wiretaps. Of course, Converse, wasn't supposed to leak this information or give it to anyone. But the company Converse Infosys was actually 50% subsidized by the Israeli government. And in 1997, the agencies in the U.S. federal government speculated that both of these companies, on some level, blew this operation by essentially leaking or giving the information over to Israeli organized crime. And what it enabled them to do is twofold. Converse Infosys leaks enabled these Israeli organized criminals to know when they were being wiretapped. So that's a major thing. It's like if you know you're being wiretapped, you know not to talk on the phone. That's a pretty big deal.
Yes.
The other thing was even crazier. They believe Amdocs was actually leaking phone records to Israeli organized criminals in order to figure out which DEA agents and federal investigators were investigating them so that the Israeli organized criminals could surveil them. to actually figure out their movements, so they could identify which DEA agents were investigating them and figure out where they were and where they were going to be. And that's like almost like a counterintelligence operation, really, that these Israeli organized drug traffickers were able to pull off. Now, there's some crossover too, where the federal government is sort of implying, but without spelling it out directly in these memos, that they believe that Israeli organized crime also works with Israeli intelligence, and there's crossover between the two. Because not only were these companies blowing drug investigations, they were also blowing counterterrorism investigations. Those are the two major types of investigations that these internal government documents describe being blown by these companies. So that presents a whole another equation to it, where it's like these private companies, and they aren't even cutouts. I mean, these aren't cutout companies. They are real companies that do a lot of business.
And they still
basically
exist,
have a
right?
back door. Yeah, I mean, I think one of them changed their name. I think Converse might have changed its name, but yes, they both still exist. Yeah.
And you point out in the podcast too. I mean, what a scandal! And again, imagine if this was a Chinese or a Russian company operating in the U.S. I mean, we would never hear the end of it. But an allied nation, owned company doing it, it's suddenly it's just not an issue. I mean, if you Google Amdocs, I mean, it's not like tons of scandal-ridden articles about the belief that they were leaking information to Israeli mafia elements and also possibly Israeli intelligence. And Robbie, I might be wrong about this, but weren't like some of the art students, didn't they claim employment at Amdocs or something?
Oh, well, that's another interesting part of this. Is six of the Israeli art students were actually Amdocs employees. That's on record. And even more interesting is the DEA memo itself. This is all leaked before anybody really knew anything about Amdocs. So like the DEA memo itself, if you didn't know the Amdocs story, you would think nothing of it. But in it, they sort of detail how one of the people that they arrested, who was an Israeli art student, got bailed out of jail by an Israeli national who was an Amdocs recruiter. And they go on in the memo to describe like what Amdocs is and why that's strange to them, but without really explaining why they thought Amdocs was like a problematic company. So without knowing that other side of it, you might just skip over that in the memo, but they're already talking about Amdocs in the DA memo itself and how there's some sort of weird crossover between the company and this spy ring.
I know that this is probably a lot to digest and whatnot. And if if this feels a bit daunting to you as a listener, I mean, I think Robbie and I are in the, right there along with you. We're in the same boat. I mean, it's such a strange story. And just again, trying to, think of the most like logical explanation to what's happening here. You're kind of stuck. I mean, it obviously I think if you really look at all of this, Amdocs, the spy ring, blowing drug cases and possibly even counterterrorism cases, Israeli mafia, which again you brilliant, you make just the simple. You point this out as a simple fact. I mean, if the American mafia works with the CIA, why wouldn't the Israeli mafia work with their version of the CIA, Mossad? And I mean, yeah, it's just that should be obvious, I think, especially when you're talking about drug trafficking and any intelligence, a good intelligence apparatus always wants to latch on to drug trafficking profits because it's it's untraceable money. It's such a complex web that's being woven here, and it seems to me there's got to be the whole question of ecstasy trafficking is got to be kind of front and center. There seems to be something about this particular this market of drugs that they are trying to completely dominate. Maybe we're getting up towards, I think, the end of the first hour here. And maybe, in the second hour, we can continue this story a little bit. And then I think we'll jump around maybe to the Russiagate stuff and Mueller. But there's a few other little things I wanted to, touch on regarding the Israeli art students and the ecstasy trade, and maybe just the ecstasy trade in general, because I think that's an interesting facet of all of this. But yeah, I think we will continue that in the second hour. Again, I am speaking with Robbie Martin, the host of Media Roots Radio. You can find his work at mediaroots.org, also averyheavyagenda.com. You are listening live here on Ocelli.com, and I think we will be taking some calls in the second hour. That number is 319-527-5016. So just stay tuned.
Straight out of the subway in New York City. Yeah, baby. The radio show that never sleeps. Porkins Policy Radio with Pierce Redmond.
WallStreetWindow.com. Gold, silver, the stock market. WallStreetWindow.com. The brilliant author of The War State brings you exclusive reports about the big changes upcoming in the markets. WallStreetWindow.com.
Perhaps you're invested deeply.
Perhaps you're not in deep enough. Maybe you're thinking about getting started. WallStreetWindow.com. Michael Swanson, the brilliant author of The War State, understood these trends professionally for many years, and now he gives you the benefit of his knowledge. WallStreetWindow.com. Go there now. Go there now. Go there now. Go there now.
Really hot looking?
Monday night.
A reminder that this is the voice of America broadcasting worldwide.
Transistor Radio.
Morning. Uncle, the podcast.
The Ocelli Effect.
Jeffrey.
Porkins Policy Radio with Pierce Redmond.
On Ocelli.com.
Uncle, I'll bet you remember the time when Benjamin Fulford said that the Asian Secret Society was going to dispatch ninjas to take out the Illuminati to change the entire world for the better.
That is never gonna happen. That never did.
It never did it?
Mm-mm.
Yeah, because there's a lot of false promises.
It's fools? I can't say well.
We better not say and be polite, but there are no false promises at the Ocelli.com radio network.
That's exactly it. It's truth, the point, right to the point. And this is what I like. Straight to the point. Ocelli.com.
Listen now.
Listen now.
nuclear holocaust. You know what uranium is, right? This thing called nuclear weapons and other things, like lots of, you know what uranium is, right? Bad things. Things are done with uranium, including some bad things. Nuclear holocaust. You know what uranium is, right? I've been briefed. Nuclear holocaust. Nuclear holocaust. You know what uranium is, right? This thing called nuclear weapons and other things, like lots of, you know what uranium is, right? Bad things. Things are done with uranium, including some bad things. Nuclear holocaust. Nuclear holocaust. Nuclear holocaust. Nuclear holocaust. Nuclear holocaust.
Now back to the man, Pierce Redman.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to Porkins Policy Radio. Of course, this is your host, Pierce Redman. If you are joining us here in the second hour, we are continuing our conversation with good friend Robbie Martin of Media Roots Radio. You can find his stuff at MediaRoots.org as well as averyheavyagenda.com. You can also, I guess I didn't mention, you can always follow Robbie on Twitter at Fluorescent Gray. And I'm just now realizing that I forgot to mention, if you want to support me, you can always go to patreon.com/Pierce Redman, and you can become a subscriber for as little as $1 a month. Well, we are here in the second hour. As promised, I said we would take some calls. So if any faithful listeners out there want to call in and perhaps ask Robbie and I some questions about what we were discussing in the first hour, once again, the call-in number is 319-527-5016. If you do call in, you'll be put on hold. Just wait a few seconds, and Chuck will bring you onto the call. Robbie, we were sort of wrapping up the end of the first hour there. We were talking about Amdocs, talking about the possibility, or at least the belief by some in the Drug Enforcement Agency, that Amdocs and Converse Infosys were possibly involved in blowing large drug trafficking cases. And I guess we would be remiss if we didn't just sort of touch on the fact of Israeli involvement in both on a criminal element and possibly in an intelligence element in the ecstasy trade. And this is actually something that you touched on in your interview with Emanuel Sferios. The fact that it was widely believed within the rave community that Mossad and elements of the Israeli mafia were involved in trafficking ecstasy. And maybe you can just sort of touch on that a little bit. And this is something that I don't think will really be new for a lot of people out there. You even referenced the movie Holy Rollers with Jesse Eisenberg in your podcast on all of this. But just tell the listeners a little bit about, the Israeli connection to the global ecstasy trade.
Well, it's interesting. So in the late 90s, the majority of all the large ecstasy busts, including the largest ecstasy dealer distributor in the United States, were all Israeli nationals. And it was widely known by the DEA and other government agencies in the 90s that it appeared that Israelis dominated the MDMA trade. Now, when I talked to Emanuel, one of his interesting takeaways, just something that he learned from being involved in that scene for a long time, was that it was apparently common knowledge back then that the Mossad and the Israeli government had some kind of relationship to the MDMA trade and the smuggling routes specifically that were used. Now, what I didn't learn from Emanuel, but I learned later on after speaking to him, is that part of the reason for that is the diamond smuggling routes that were popular and used by organized crime for a long time. And then it actually involved a lot of Hasidic and Orthodox Jews who smuggled these diamonds were sort of organically already, associated with the regions of the world where ecstasy was coming from. The Netherlands, Belgium, that's where a lot of the diamond smuggling routes came from,
right,
that were dominated by, Israelis. Now, that's how sort of a lot of that crossover happened, is Israelis got in there very early and dominated the ecstasy trade using similar smuggling routes, using similar couriers, drug mules, who were essentially diamond couriers before that. The reason apparently was that, diamonds and ecstasy were also, similarly small and could be smuggled in a similar fashion to diamonds. They didn't have an odor like other drugs like marijuana or even like cocaine, which drug sniffing dogs at the time, I don't even know if they're able to sniff out ecstasy even now. At the time, they definitely were, more drug sniffing dogs were definitely more trained to sniff out things like heroin, marijuana, cocaine, things like that. So it makes sense on that level, but the actual, the connection between the actual Mossad and the trade itself is a little bit more elusive and takes some weird twists and turns. I mean, I think that the Amdocs example that we have is probably the best indicator and the best documentation we have that there is some major crossover between the Israeli organized crime drug trade and the Mossad. If the DEA believed that these companies are operating as a backdoor conduit to both simultaneously, Israeli intelligence and the Israeli drug trade, that's very interesting and implies that there is definitely some crossover there, especially when one of these companies, Converse Infosys, is 50% subsidized by the Israeli government. That needs to be taken into account as well. Why would a company that's being funded, 50% by the Israeli government be blowing all these major drug busts and leaking information to help Israeli organized criminals track federal investigators in the United States? That implies there's definitely some crossover there. But there's another interesting story that I cover in the podcast about a major El Chapo level ecstasy dealer in the United States named Jacob Orgad. I think it might be Orgad. I might be pronouncing his last name wrong. But his nickname was Cookie. He also worked with and had a relationship with Heidi Fleiss at some point. And he got busted with the largest ecstasy distribution network in the United States at the time. And he used he self-identified as an ex-Mossad agent as sort of part of his clout, part of his esteem in organized crime in the United States. And a lot of people believed him. But what's come out since then is that, a lot of journalists have sort of concluded he must have been lying about that. That was sort of a backstory, an urban legend he created for himself to just seem like more like a tough guy. Like he could get people assassinated and, he had more reach than a typical drug dealer or whatever. But what a lot of articles and journalists have discovered is that his actual network and his abilities were far beyond that of a typical big-time drug dealer operating in the United States. His abilities and his skills and his reach and his organizational structure of his business was so sophisticated that it does appear to match up with an intelligence background. So that's one of the fascinating things about the biggest ecstasy dealer ever busted in the United States, is that he was self-identified Mossad. And even though, most journalists say he was lying, his activities and his abilities appear to be informed by intelligence training. And it's also worth noting, and this is a basic fact that, most people already know, but it is legally required of you when you reach the age of 18 in Israel to serve in the IDF for a period of time, compulsory military service. Now, oftentimes, a lot of these people will later go into military intelligence or in some kind of intelligence. So it's also noteworthy that a lot of these Israeli art students that we've been talking about are sort of college age or even younger, because that would be around the time where they would sort of be graduating from their compulsory military service in the IDF. So that also makes me believe on some level this might have even been like some kind of amateur intelligence training program, or that might have been the guise of it to get some of these people recruited because of their age. That's just another thought that's popped up for me. I really have no proof of that, but at the age group of what most of these Israeli art students are is noteworthy. Like, why are they the age that is right after you finish serving your compulsory IDF service if you're an Israeli citizen? That's strange to me. I don't know if I might have gone off on too much of a tangent there, but I could talk a little bit more about the ecstasy trade.
It's interestingly, you're just sort of it made me think, what if this was almost like a training exercise, kind of like, listen, you guys can get your feet wet. You can basically, you can screw up. Nothing bad is going to happen. Obviously, nothing bad happened to any of the 200 or so spies that, they just got deported back to Israel. Presumably, I mean, they suffered no repercussions in Israel. If anything, some of them were on, like I said, national talk shows in Israel talking about what they were doing. So,
those four guys you're talking about are the only ones I know of that suffered actual repercussions, in the sense that they were detained for about a month. Some of them were even given polygraph tests, and they were revoked of their ability to. I think their visas were revoked for a long period of time, but they're also banned, I think, from coming back to the United States. So that was like the greatest punishment that we know of that any of these suspected spies suffered after being arrested.
Yeah. Right, certainly. And I guess also, like, on some level, they were outed. We know who they are. We saw, there's videos of them, pictures of them. I mean, all of these, the art students, I mean, we don't really know who they are. You wouldn't be able to, not that I could really pick out, like, the dancing Israelis, out of a lineup, but I mean, with a little, bit of internet research, you probably could.
Well, here's the other interesting thing I forgot to mention is in the DEA memo, if you actually go pull it up, there are about 40 or 50 different names identified, and even addresses and phone numbers, and in some cases passport ID numbers of these suspected Israeli spies. Now, what's crazy is I was talking to someone, I believe it was DJ Thermal Detonator on Twitter, who was saying that he knows someone who actually got in touch with one of those suspects. And talk to him. So these people some of them are still out there. I mean, their name, these are apparently their real names. They're not aliases. So we can, if somebody really wanted to do the legwork, they could try to contact every single suspect on this list and see if any of them will talk. I mean, they're all young people around the time that this memo was written. So presumably they're all still out there.
That's even stranger that they would use their real names. That they wouldn't. Again, I mean, it strikes me as this can't be bad spycraft, which is part of like my reasoning between like I just don't buy the whole dancing Israelis, the Zionists are behind 9/11, because it's so sloppy. Almost, you have to wonder, like, are they trying to get you to think that? I mean, and with something like this, I mean, the art students using their own names, presumably we could look them up. I mean, there has to be something more to it. Nobody is that dumb. You don't get to be a spy if you're that careless. There's certainly not one without serious repercussions. I mean, if you were supposed to use an alias and you didn't, I mean, that's just crazy to me. So again, there's layers to this story that are not being explored, and in a lot of ways, it's kind of sad that it's difficult to explore it. I mean, you and I'm sure we're going to get emails. There's certainly some comments on YouTube about how we don't understand what we're talking about. We're missing it. We're actually working for Mossad. It's like you can't really, unfortunately, you can't bring up this story in either the conspiracy or the mainstream culture. Because and I don't know why, like Ketchum gets this real rap as being, he's like a gatekeeper and whatever. And I mean, even if he is, so what? I mean, you're just going to dismiss all of his writing on this particular topic? I mean, he actually did reporting. He did research. If you're just going to dismiss it because it doesn't fit your anti-Zionist theory, well, I don't really know what I can do for you. But he did more work on this than anyone else, maybe other than Carl Cameron at the time.
Exactly.
Another interesting, and I think this is sort of like, this isn't necessarily a connection, but it's just interesting. Again, talking about like the global ecstasy trade, and kind of returning to that. Have you ever heard, Robbie, this guy Wouter Basson? He was apartheid era chemical biological warfare expert. He worked on this thing called Project Coast and a bunch of other stuff in apartheid South Africa. But he was also busted for this like massive ecstasy producing lab. And I bring this up only because of, Israel and apartheid South Africa's close connections, in terms of nuclear capabilities and just in general, they were extremely close, on a political level. But Besson, it was, he talked about this, I think, in his trials and stuff. This is, I think, maybe in like 2002 or something like that. It was like government policy within apartheid South Africa to produce ecstasy. So it was a government program to produce ecstasy, and then to spread it to the black community within South Africa. And it was sort of this like MK Ultra type, project where I think they thought that, whatever, they would pacify the, black youth or radical youth or get them addicted to drugs or whatever. But yeah, it was just like this weird little like, and I think it happened, very late in like the apartheid government. This was sort of like a last ditch effort or something like that. But yeah, it was this like strange little project where they were producing like massive quantities of ecstasy. And then of course you have to wonder, like what happened to all that ecstasy when you have, especially like when, I don't know, markets and stuff open up. And again, like when rave culture kind of takes off in, the UK and, later in like, New York and California and places like that. I mean, suddenly you've got, I don't know, thousands, hundreds of thousands of pills worth millions of dollars. Certainly you're going to start selling it. So just a weird little connection, and it doesn't surprise me at all. But I guess, Robbie, is there anything else specific to what we've been talking about, the Israeli art students, Amdocs, ecstasy trade, anything like that you want to, leave the listeners with? Because again, I encourage people to go and listen to Robbie's full episode. It's over 2 hours. There's lots of little clips in there. You read from a lot of the, the DEA memos and stuff like that. I'll try and get all those links from Robbie. We'll link up to it in the show notes for this. But anything else that you want to let the listeners know about, or any kind of like final thoughts on it? Because I think it's one of these. Unfortunately, it's one of these topics that we don't have enough information, and unfortunately, it's so kind of taboo and like third rail type of a story that people don't really kind of touch it, or the people that do touch it, it's only in this really kind of closed-minded way. So anything you want to impart on the listeners?
Yeah, I mean, I would impart on the listeners, look deeper into, this larger story of the Israeli art students. It's all very well documented. There's great, resources like in the form of the DEA memo. We don't often, when stories like this come out, often we don't have a 65-page long leaked government document identifying, up to 40 spies. I mean, that's kind of like impressive that story has a basis like that. So that's, to me, just, I wanted to emphasize that just to explain how factually based it is and how non-speculative a lot of what we've been talking about is. But then on the other hand, because a lot of truthers and people have sort of ran with the dancing Israeli stories and added on to that, it makes it difficult to actually research that and see it for, perhaps for what it was or just what actually happened there. And, those 4 Israeli men were arrested. They were acting so crazy and suspicious by celebrating. This is not really up for dispute. They were acting very happy and they were celebrating the attacks. Someone called the police on them, and they belonged to a company that U.S. investigators and the FBI believed to be a cutout operation of Israeli intelligence. The FBI, in a document, believed that these 4 men were Israeli intelligence. The company's name was called Urban Moving Systems. It's a moving company that, again, was some kind of cutout fake thing. It wasn't really a moving company. There was other cutouts too. I mean, one of the weird ones I mentioned in my podcast was there was a cutout mall kiosk that sold this toy called Zoomcopter, then ended up mysteriously shutting down all around the country after these roundups happened. And it was an Israeli company, and the FBI and other government agencies also suspect that was an Israeli intelligence front. Now, just going back to these 4 men really quick, they were caught driving in their van. And when they were pulled over, they told the police that we're not the ones you need to worry about. You need to worry about the Palestinians. They told the police, which is interesting because I documented, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that there were powerful forces trying to feed the media a false narrative that Palestinians were actually behind the 9/11 attacks. There's multiple examples of this.
The Kagans.
The Kagans being one, but I mean, saying that the DFLP, this Palestinian Liberation Group, is behind the attacks was actually the first claim of responsibility read live on the media by multiple media networks, long before bin Laden was identified as the culprit. So that's interesting. And just another fun fact that I never got a chance to talk about on my previous podcast that your listeners might be kind of surprised by is that the DEA itself has a strange connection to the origin of MDMA becoming a popular party drug. And that comes from MDMA was actually invented as a muscle relaxer, I believe, in like the 1930s or 40s by some European pharmaceutical guy. They didn't really understand the properties of it. It was kind of slept on by the science community for many years. And a DEA employee, a DEA researcher and scientist named Alexander Shulgin, who went by the name Sasha, he actually wrote the handbook for the DEA. He was a seasoned DEA employee, longtime career DEA guy. And with the DEA's money and research budget, he was researching extracts and the psychedelic and psychoactive properties of nutmeg. And so you can find all these weird papers that he wrote about nutmeg and its psychedelic effects. He moved on to writing papers about how saffron extract had psychedelic effects. And from there, he sort of and I don't know exactly how he discovered this, but he discovered the psychedelic properties of MDMA, somehow based off of all this plant extraction research he was doing. One of the main precursors for decades that MDMA used to be manufactured was saffron oil. And it was actually like it was like really hard to find it. You could go to like botanical oil extract, essential oil places, and it would be like, if you're buying saffron oil, you can only buy this much, or if you buy more than this much, we basically send it off to a letter to the DEA saying how much you bought. So Alexander Shulgin, the guy who wrote the handbook for the DEA, discovered the psychedelic properties of MDMA, left the DEA, and became like a psychedelic drug advocate, basically fighting against DEA propaganda. And even before DanceSafe existed, this guy, Alexander Shulgin, was testing pills himself, like from his own home. And after he left the DEA actually raided him. They seized a bunch of his lab equipment, and he became sort of an enemy of the DEA. But what he did was sort of like open sourcing, dozens and dozens of psychedelic drug recipes to the public as sort of a way to push back against the DEA propaganda at that time. And there's dozens of drugs that he basically invented based off of MDMA, LSD, DMT, and all these things. And he's basically become like the new godfather of psychedelic drugs. It's just a weird thing that he wrote the DEA's handbook, and he became that. I mean, it's a strange thing. He passed away a few years ago, but I always found that just a strange connection. That's where he comes from. But
Robbie, I think he's also interviewed in Emanuel Sferios made a film called like MDMA the movie, and I believe he interviewed him just before he passed away.
That makes sense, yeah.
And actually, the history of MDMA and ecstasy, I mean, is super interesting. And I was actually kind of got in like went down like a rabbit hole after listening to your show. Looking at it and there's also the whole, that it's being used in some strange Pentagon testing right now. And there's actually quite a division within the psychedelic community over, they're big proponents of MDMA therapy, which is how it was used for many, many years in a psychiatrist's office. But there's, there are some people that are a bit fearful of the Pentagon seems to be very interested in using MDMA to treat PTSD. And there's some arguments to be made. Are they trying to, fix soldiers to send them back out? And there's some people that think no, if you really give them MDMA, they'll become peace-loving activists, and I don't really buy that. I don't know quite about the super soldier thing. I don't know if that's exactly what it is, but it's an interesting topic all the same. And this is something, I don't know if you, I ended up, in my, rabbit hole the other day. I listened to, have you ever heard of the podcast Psychedelics Today?
No, I have not.
It's I had never really heard of it either, but I was trying to find more information on Emanuel Sferios, and he was interviewed on this podcast talking about the history of MDMA. He's still a big proponent of its therapeutic use, and he was promoting his film. And anyway, he was talking about some of the history of it, because there's also it was like a club drug in the 80s, like in Texas, like bars and clubs where you could still buy it legally.
Gay clubs mostly.
Yeah, exactly. And that's like this other strange little historical factoid about it. But he was also talking about the infamous Rave Act, which was like an act passed by Congress, which, originally it was like almost like he said there were all these crazy provisions in the act about like, they were like going after like rave culture almost to such an extent that even, like the, hardcore drug warriors were like, well, we can't criminalize music. Like they're written into the act were these things about like, if a song had a certain amount of beats per minute, then it was like rave music, and then you could shut down a club for doing that. And the Rave Act, the Rave Act literally stands for Reducing Americans' Vulnerability to Ecstasy. And
wow,
yeah, and it was of course who authored it and pushed it through, Joe Biden.
Wow,
yeah,
I had no idea about this.
Neither
I know there's a UK act that was very similar, passed in 1994, that one of my favorite musical groups, Autechre, actually made an EP about because in the clause of the act it said like music with a certain kind of repetitive beat.
Yes,
basically they're trying to describe techno music specifically.
Right.
So this band made an album that had no repeating beats. Like it was like every bar was like a new beat. And it explains on like the liner notes that's like it was in response to the bill. So yeah, no, it's weird. I mean, it's kind of like when how they discriminate against African Americans still by saying like, no sports jerseys, no Nike shoes. Like when you go into certain clubs, It's basically like saying like, no, black people who wear a certain particular type of clothing is really what it's meant for.
Right.
But
and I should note too that the Reducing Americans' Vulnerability to Ecstasy Act, they did change that name because they couldn't get it. It was like too insane, and it was less about the drug and more about like the entire sort of dance culture, and by extension, like, house music, techno, all that kind of stuff. They reworked it, but it's still colloquially known as the Rave Act, and it was authored and pushed through by Joe Biden, who, of course, his daughter Ashley was there was a video, that was the New York Post and Radar Online had of her snorting coke at a party. This was like just after Obama was elected, a couple months after that. And supposedly Joe Biden's daughter was a regular when she was at Tulane University at Disco Don's, which is a famous club in New Orleans, where, ecstasy was just everywhere. And it's just one of those interesting, it's like maybe from a good place, but like it's like a typical like politician's like misguided abuse of power. My daughter maybe is a drug user or has a drug problem or simply takes drugs for fun. And I don't like it. So I'm going to push through some crazy draconian law. And obviously that didn't do anything because, a couple of years later, she's, trying to figure out, what friend clandestinely filmed her snorting coke at a party in Delaware. So just an interesting, another little weird factoid about like the history of ecstasy and MDMA and like rave culture in general. And it's one of those, like, of course, it's like fucking Joe Biden, just not understanding youth culture and rebellion or anything like that. So he passes a crazy law. Also, just to completely go back, and then we'll kind of shift gears a little bit. It was just interesting. My final thoughts on what you were saying about the Israeli art students and all that stuff. And linking the Palestinians, and I saw Chuck messaged us. That Howard Stern also reported Palestinian responsibility on the day of 9/11. It's interesting, that angle of if this was some kind of operation. You mentioned it earlier when we were talking about, the whole, if you see something, say something, and how all of these, hundreds of Israeli art students were doing stuff that if you saw it, you would be inclined to say something. And then, also the whole, we're not your enemies, the Palestinians are your enemies, and how, Donald Trump, the great 9/11 truther, he pushed this he appeared to be referring to the dancing Israelis when he said, those Arabs that were dancing in New Jersey celebrating. And I don't know if he is actually aware that he was misspeaking, because I know Dan Rather, I think it was Dan Rather was on Letterman or something talking about dancing Arabs when clearly they were not Arabs. And it's just one of those strange, it seeps into the popular consciousness to such a level. And it's interesting too, it was that part of this operation, is getting that idea into various people's minds. I mean, maybe that was a sort of a sub goal of the Israeli art students, is just, if you have hundreds of people going to government facilities acting weird, that preps people, it gets them, it raises their guard. Maybe that was part of it. So that's just an interesting kind of bookend to that whole thing. Because now, of course, believe me, I get paranoid on the train, when I see someone's left a black backpack, and there's this sudden twinge of oh God, is it, let me look at the people around me. This is it. And that's just ingrained, I think, after so many years of that kind of fear and propaganda. But Robbie, we also wanted to change gears a little bit, and because we've talked many times before on my show. I think I've even talked about it on Media Roots before about the Russiagate stuff, this kind of hoax investigation, and there was of a listener of both of ours was tweeting us to, they wanted us to discuss it to some extent. And I'm actually kind of like, I just don't care anymore. I really enjoyed the show that you and Abby did addressing it. And I like that, you played some of these old clips, because you guys really were like out front on this so early on. And I think, unlike most of the other people taking victory laps, and maybe we'll talk about a few of them, you really linked this, to the kind of new Cold War rhetoric. And I guess I'll open it up to you, Robbie, because I honestly was just like, cool, can we stop talking about this? And instead, we've got people like Michael Tracy. It's just like, enough already. We get it. You were right. Okay. And, it's like, I find it interesting that the people that have been speaking the loudest about how this is such a distraction and how this is distracting us from all the important stuff and this is, it's propaganda, they are the ones now that are even louder talking about it.
Yeah.
And it's like, I find Michael Tracy to be problematic, to say the least. Especially like, I don't know, anyone that gets retweeted that much by Mike Cernovich and doesn't seem to have a problem with it is just weird. And then going on Tucker Carlson is even more bizarre. But the way that he's now just nonstop talking about this, it is like, this is the next distraction. So I don't know. I'll open it up to you, wherever you want to go with that. Well,
I guess I'll use this opportunity to shit on some people. I mean, I think they deserve criticism, and I don't want to act like I know more than them. I mean, some of them have been looking closer at the intricacies of the Russiagate case than I have. But it is interesting to me that sort of the four people who are getting the most credit for being right on this issue are all people who have, problematic things going on with them. I mean, two of them, Greenwald and Tracy, are both very apologetic of the right wing in a lot of cases. Tracy's out there right now trying to make people feel really bad for Manafort for having solitary confinement because, in his mind, if you care about Chelsea Manning's solitary confinement, then why aren't you outraged at Manafort? So that's where his brain is going. Greenwald and him both appeared on Tucker Carlson. They both promoted him. Don Jr. recently is retweeting Michael Tracy about being right on the Russiagate stuff. So it is unusual to me that you don't really get any real staunch leftists who are right on Russiagate, or even people like Katrina Vanden Heuvel or Mark Ames or Yasha Levine or Stephen Cohen being elevated to the status of being right on Russiagate. And I just find that kind of unusual. And also, Aaron Mate has done a lot of good work on this subject. He's been very dedicated to it. But he's definitely got some blind spots. I mean, I remember I had a conversation with him a couple years ago asking him about Vice and Cold War 2.0 stuff. He used to work for Vice. He seemed completely oblivious to the sort of Vice pushing early Cold War 2.0 propaganda, which I find a little bit strange for someone who is, following this story so closely. So, and then I guess one issue I have with the way Aaron Mate and Tracy approach the subject, and even Greenwald and Matt Taibbi, is they have conceded basically to me what is one of the main points of the argument. They have conceded more or less that Russia probably did hack the DNC and the Podesta emails and did somehow get those to WikiLeaks and disrupt the election in that way. That they've conceded that point, which I find personally very odd because that was never really proven in any of the Mueller indictments and any of the government reports. So cyber attribution, is very easy to fake. I find that frustrating that they're the main people out there getting credit for debunking Russiagate when, as far as I'm concerned, they have sort of conceded the main point. And, someone like Taibbi, jumped into this very late as well. As far as I'm concerned, this anti-Russia hysteria has been going strong since 2014, not, only 2016, which was when Russiagate really started. And ultimately, now that Trump is basically exonerated, what purpose did it really serve other than continuing to elevate the already existing anti-Russia hysteria propaganda campaign. And, you know, it's frustrating even to hear like Matt Taibbi talk about it, because he'll bring up his disdain for 9/11 truthers and compare Russiagate hysterics, like people who think Trump is a Russian Manchurian candidate, to crazy 9/11 truthers who, you know, were traumatized by 9/11, so they needed answers and a simplistic narrative to sum it all up. You know, I find that insulting because in reality, it's much more similar actually to the people who bought into the war on terror after the trauma of 9/11 and just believed a government, you know, constructed narrative. I mean, so for him to compare those believers to truthers rather than the people who bought into Bush's war on terror just seems odd to me. It just seems like an unnecessary jab. And I just think it's stupid. And Matt Taibbi, of course, wrote a chapter-long screed in his book mocking truthers and strawmanning them, making them all sound like they're people who thinks George W. Bush pushed down the detonator to blow up the World Trade Center. You know, that kind of stupid crap. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say that they're, you know, I'm glad that they're out there pushing against Russiagate, but it is odd to me that they're the ones being elevated right now. And it's just also, I do think there is something to the idea that there does seem to be a climate in place or some kind of propaganda framework to elevate the people who are sort of right-wing baited as being like, oh, well, you're a Trump apologist who says you're on the left who doesn't believe in Russiagate. Well, then you're an idiot. Or it's like it's almost like it reminds me of how people are trying to associate someone like Cernovich with anti-war,
right? Or
even Richard Spencer, because it's like, wait, so is anti-war now the domain of racists and Trump apologists? It's a strange, it is sort of a strange. I'm not saying Greenwald and Tracy and these people are Trump apologists, but the fact that they do sort of blend into this sort of right-wing sphere and they apologize for Tucker Carlson and have no problem appearing on his show, it's weird to me that those are the people being elevated. And it just makes me wonder why. I mean, there's a lot of people on the left who are always saying this was fake, who also think Tucker Carlson is a dangerous racist and a phony, but they're not being elevated. So you have to wonder why that is.
Oh, I honestly forgot Matt Taibbi existed. I was like sort of floored when people were, talking about, what? Who the hell is Matt Taibbi anymore? Who honestly, I stopped caring about his opinion on stuff years ago, and I was just, I didn't understand why people were like, oh man, like, Matt Taibbi is, he's fun, he's laying down the law. And it was like, oh, if Matt Taibbi says it, then suddenly this is huge, right? I mean, who the hell is Matt Taibbi anymore? I mean, when is anyone, linked to an article of his or I honestly didn't even know that he was such a, I don't know, Russiagate denier or whatever, or debunker or something like that.
He jumped on the bandwagon. I mean, He jumped on the bandwagon later in the argument, and he wrote for Rolling Stone, so he got, he kind of filled in. He jumped into a void. I mean, there's barely anyone who's progressive or on the left who is writing serious pieces trying to debunk the narrative, and he did it in Rolling Stone and got quite a lot of, accolades and publicity for that. So it kind of makes sense. But yeah, I mean, I prefer to follow people who have a very, deep contextual knowledge base about all this. People like Mark Ames and Yasha Levine, I look to, as people who actually know a lot about Russia. They used to live there. So it bugged. And also, I mean, The Intercept in general, did really poor coverage on the original, anti-Russian hysteria wave. I mean, they if you look up Ukraine, for example, on their website, I mean, a lot of the articles about Ukraine are kind of like echoing a U.S. imperialistic point of view. And there's very little coverage at all, really, about it.
Well, and Omidyar dumping money into, neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine, during the Maidan.
That too.
I mean, it's no shocker.
And the fact that Omidyar now is also donating and funding the Bulwark, which is Bill Kristol's new outlet, and he's a total Russiagator. I mean, he talks about Putin and Russia constantly. If you can follow him on Twitter, I mean, he sounds just like any neoliberal politician like Biden or Hillary Clinton talking about Russia. So that's odd. And you know, it is kind of a shame. But you know, I'm not going to say that they shouldn't be out there debunking it because it's important that they are. But yeah, I mean, it is true that a lot of those figures that we were talking about spent a long time not going after Trump for his real policy, like his actual dangerous policy. And they long argued that Russiagate was a distraction from that, but yet they're still not talking about that. And it doesn't seem like their focus is going to go there anytime soon. And that's bothersome too, because it's like, well, so now that it's over, let's actually focus on what's really going on. I mean, and I don't really have much hope that they're going to do that. I mean, it seems like people like Greenwald and Tracy are more reactionary towards sort of the neoliberal propaganda and the mainstream media's hatred against Trump than they are against who's actually sitting in office right now.
Yes.
To me, it just seems very reactionary, and the focus is wrong. And I guess that's, you know, pretty much where my thoughts go on that.
Well, and I also find it interesting, you know, Tracy is constantly tweeting about Tulsi Gabbard, you know, the new messiah amongst the so-called anti-war leftists.
So is Greenwald, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, which is just like, I don't know. I mean, I have all sorts of, you know, since we've like last discussed Tulsi Gabbard and, you know, looking more into, I mean, I have so many other questions about, you know, the movement behind her, you know, I think that like a lot of the right wingers that like her, I think, you know, some of them are opportunistic. I think David Duke just, you know, says he likes her to upset people. You know, or that, you know, David Duke is being used by some other, you know, force to torpedo her career maybe or something like that, you know, because now, of course, Tulsi Gabbard, you know, loves David Duke, or David Duke is, you know, connected to her. But it's interesting to me, you know, I think you're so spot on there, Robbie, with the assertion that, you know, this isn't the like 9/11, you know, truther syndrome. This is really the war on terror sort of syndrome that I think infected a lot of people's minds into believing Russiagate. And it's interesting that you have some of these people out there making a name for themselves, you know, attacking people that kind of fell victim to that, and yet at the same time they're promoting a presidential candidate who is so, I don't know, like encapsulated by the reality of the war on terror, like Tulsi Gabbard. I mean, her whole career, you know, or her campaign at this moment is predicated on the idea of stamping out terrorism. That we still, you know, need to invade countries and have troops around the world, and you know, the evil Muslims must be stopped at you know, at all costs and stuff like that. So you know, I don't know. I just it's very bizarre to me. And again, it just I don't even want to really go on too much more about it, because I think it really is like a dead horse for me. But it's just interesting, again, you know, we're certainly 2019 is really the age of grifters, and you still got these people that are, you know, they're grifting in another way right now, where it's, you know, give me money so I'll talk about how all the, you know, Russiagate people are stupid. It just, I mean,
it's a strange thing, Pierce. I mean, one really troubling thing that's happened over the past few years, even happening before Trump, is the right wing sort of circuit has essentially taken from the left this notion of free speech and turned it into their own issue. All this college campus stuff, you know, the SJWs trying to shut down events or whatever.
Candace Owens at Congress right now.
The right has done an incredible job of seizing on that issue and turning it into their own thing. So now even when you talk about free speech, it almost seems like it's the domain of the right. And I worry that there is a deliberate effort being made by right-wing billionaires, and I don't know who. I mean, I'm just speculating, to make the domain of anti-war somehow be of the right, to make the primary idea of anti-war linked directly to nationalism And what I mean by that is watering down the concept so much that the primary belief becomes, why are we wasting money in these other countries to help these basically foreign, people who are subhuman?
Right.
And why aren't we helping us good old-fashioned Americans to help us enrich our country instead? And I'm worried that is a sentiment that a lot of people in this country actually do feel, and they're trying to seize on that to again steal another issue and the energy from the left and sort of make that their own domain. And that's why I have problems with a candidate like Tulsi Gabbard, because I feel like a lot of her ideas are actually informed by right-wing beliefs. And I don't even mean libertarian anti-war beliefs. I mean like Islamophobic, like
right-wing Hindu
neoconservative
fascist beliefs. Yeah.
Well, that as well. I mean, but I also think some of the things she says about radical Islam, to me, sound like Sam Harris and other new atheist people who I think are basically stealth neocons. So it is problematic that you have people who are very progressive or who say they're progressive promoting her and getting really upset when you don't like her and when you point out these things. I mean, it's like, to me, being, not playing into any aspect of war on terror propaganda is really important to me to be able to support a politician. And, there are so many red flags in that regard with Tulsi Gabbard that I unequivocally cannot support her just based on what she says about Islam and the way she talks about the Muslim world. I find it very problematic and it makes me cringe. And it's actually shocking to me. More people on the left also don't have the same reaction because, like I said, Sam Harris and her don't sound too dissimilar when talking about Islam.
No. Well, and every time I cover this on the show, I always get a series of, comments or tweets or emails saying, but, how can you say this, Pierce? Because she's going to beat Trump. She's the best, which is like, first off, what are you talking about? Like, no, she's not. I mean, I don't even really get how you can quantify that in a political electoral sense that this woman is going to beat Trump. That in and of itself is false. But even beyond that, it's like that was the reason, we were told to vote for Hillary Clinton. So, again, now they're using all of that same, rhetoric and fervor to try and get us to vote for Tulsi Gabbard. Yeah, it's super odd. I think you're right though. This co-opting of it's like if you bring up the free speech issue, it's like I even cringe myself when I talk about it because it's like I feel like people are going to see that and think like, oh, is Porkins a right winger now? Talking about the free speech thing.
Exactly. That's what's so interesting about it is that I really feel like the right wing media apparatus and all this machinery has really, in a very short amount of time, turn that into their issue. And it's bizarre because I even feel the same way when I talk about First Amendment or free speech. I do have the same concern now. It's like, oh man, like this is something that's primarily now talked about by the right, which is and it's done in bad faith, obviously. This is the same right that wanted to shut down the art gallery. I remember as like a child, I think I was like maybe 11 when somebody in New York tried to put a crucifix inside of a vat of piss and displayed in an art gallery. And I remember it became like the main, the Christians and right-wingers everywhere they wanted that shut the fuck down. It was like their main thing, So it's almost cartoonish now that it's switched over to, now they act like they're super concerned about free speech.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you just jump to Candace Owens testifying today in front of Congress about, white nationalism. And she just used it as a platform to say that, the leftists are censoring her free speech, and that they're all evil. And anytime if they criticize her speech and idiotic things she says, they're attacking her. They hate black people. She tries to shut down the argument. So I completely agree with you. And, there also is the same people that, they didn't like that, what was that, the rendition of like Macbeth or Hamlet or something, that like Posobiec and others were protesting. It's like, how is that not free speech? It's like, I don't even get, because that's the thing, is really when you break it down, they don't really care about free speech at all. They just want they just care about, their opinion being the dominant voice.
And they just want to create these situations to make the left look hypocritical and really bad. I mean, one of Jack Posobiec's first major things that he was involved in after he periscoped live from inside Comet Pizza was he got people to hold up a sign at the first major protest against Trump right after election night at Trump Tower, a giant sign saying "Rape Melania."
Mm-hmm.
So that's what these people do. They are provocateurs. They're good at what they do, and they don't care really about free speech or the First Amendment. That's only a tool to them to gain some kind of advantage in this sort of ideological war. I mean, it's a war to them, and you're aware of that. I mean, you encounter normal right wingers now, and they'll describe Obama still as a communist Muslim, agent of some kind. And so it's a war. It's like, I guarantee you 75% of the pundits who put out that stuff about Obama knew that it was bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
They just put it out anyways because they knew that they would hit the reptile brain of their audience really in a really successful way. I mean, it's a scary thought to think that, the president of the United States, if you're a right winger, to think that he's a Marxist and he's a Muslim.
Oh, yeah.
And he went to a madrasa.
Yeah, and he's black.
He's gay.
Yeah,
and his wife is transsexual.
Right,
it's like everything you can think of, pile it on there, I mean,
exactly. Oh, no, I would be totally freaked out. I'd be counting my bullets and, canned peas in my bunker if I was a right winger. Robbie, we are just out of time right now. I want to thank Robbie Martin for joining us on the show once again. Of course, thank Robbie for the amazing new theme music. Robbie, very quickly, tell people where they can go to follow your work.
averyheavyagenda.com. That's where you can get my documentary film about the new Cold War. And at Fluorescent Gray on Twitter is kind of where I'm mostly screaming into the ether. You can hear me there. And then Media Roots Radio, it's the podcast I do with my sister. You can find it on SoundCloud, iTunes, and we also have a Patreon page at patreon.com/Media Roots Radio. And sometimes we'll release exclusive episodes just for our subscribers. So check that out.
Excellent. And I highly encourage everybody to check out all of Robbie's work. I want to thank everybody for tuning in this week. You can support me by going to patreon.com/Pierce Redmond. So if you like this show, you want to hear some more, you want to help me out, please do sign up for as little as $1 a month. Thank you all so much for listening, and I'll be talking to you very soon.
Oh,